Hello, I'm Tony.
And I'm Patrick.
And we'd like to welcome you to Cave to the Cross, Apologetics.
And today we're starting off our new book, as you saw probably in our commercial, How to Be an Atheist, Why Many Skeptics Aren't Skeptical Enough. Very provocative title by Mitch Stokes, with forward by our good friend, J.P. Moreland.
That's right.
I say good friend because I think that was the first book that you gave to me way back in the day when I first met you.
Yeah.
I'm into apologetics. Here, read Secular City.
That was J.P. Moreland's book. Yeah. Good. So he does the foreword here to Mitch Stokes' book on how to be an atheist. And so we'd like to at least walk through that a bit here just so that you can get a feel for what J.P. Moreland thinks with regard to Stokes' book. Yeah. He makes the point that that he's a skeptic. He says that so first of all, what he does is he gives us some credentials on Stokes.
His pedigree, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So he says, first, I was and am impressed with and encouraged by Professor Stokes' academic pedigree. He has a BS and MS in mechanical engineering with 5 patents. How about that, right? So he understands science well. Then, too, he received an MA in religion at Yale under Nicholas Vorsestoff, and an MA and PhD in philosophy from Notre Dame with Peter Van Inwagen and Alvin Plantinga as his dissertation supervisors. Survivors too, but probably.
But he's probably more of a survivor with Plantinga. So Plantinga is definitely a big name, especially in the Reformed epistemology camp. He's probably the preeminent philosopher of our day. Especially with regard to Reformed epistemology.
So J.P. Moreland tells us that when I read this, my head exploded. How about that, right? Yeah. Having been in ministry for 45 years, I am thrilled to see a whole movement arise typified by Stokes of well-educated Jesus lovers who can competently address the important issues of the day. So he was excited about this book, right?
And we should say, too, that Stokes seems to come, at least in this book, from again, the Reformed epistemology, which has kind of a focus on what we focus on, which is, a look at presuppositionalism. But J.P. Moreland is kind of on the other side of the issue. Other side of the issue in the sense that he's more of an evidentialist. He's using kind of a shotgun approach to say, here are scientific data to prove God exists or the possibility that God exists. So it's an interesting person to have be the forward to his book.
He says, when I got this manuscript, I literally could not put it down. I spent the day reading the entire work, he says. Wow, so that's, exciting stuff, right?
This is the second time we've read it, and the first time we read it, Stokes is a funny guy for a philosopher.
In fact, he is. He makes kind of all kinds of little quips and jokes and
So this isn't a dry book. So this is one that's it's definitely thought provoking. It's not your typical if they still had family Christian bookstores. This isn't something that you find on the front shelf. But this is definitely a book that's has a lot of good value to it.
Yeah, good. Yeah, he says. This book gives the reader an education in a number of important areas, and it teaches us how to think. So that's an interesting endorsement there with regard to a book, right? Time and time again, Stokes takes angles on an issue that is different, insightful, refreshing, and his research is exemplary. So Moreland likes his book. He thanks him at the end here for doing the hard work that made it possible to write this book. And he's happy to see it published. So he tells everybody to read it, study it, right, and ponder what he says. You'll be the better for it. So
it'll be interesting to see where the two camps go from here. I think we see with like Frank Turek, we see his utilization of practically presuppositionalism in his public debates, or not so much his debates, but his I guess he's done that one, the Unbelievable podcast. But when he's talking with students, he tends to take a presuppositional viewpoint, but then turns it and has an evidentialist.
Yeah,
so it'll be interesting to see if the two camps diverge at
Right.
points or come together at
And
points.
of course, Frank would clearly say he's not a presuppositionalist, right? Yeah.
But we've seen, like, John Frame clearly is a presuppositionalist, but at the same time, he is very...
He's not adverse to doing evidentialist arguments.
Yes,
yeah.
he's not a one or the other camp. He is
Yeah.
a presuppositional, and then comes part two, which is the evidential.
Yeah. Good. All right. Well, let's look at the preface to the book here, and this is actually, I started reading the preface before I did before I jumped into the introduction here, because this is where Stokes tells us that I'm a skeptic by training and temperament, right? So he starts off with the thing that he wants to say. And the point that he makes here, and he makes several points with regard to this preface, and we just want to bring out a couple of these so that folks get a feel for where he's going here. He says, when atheists make grand claims like this, for instance, so he says it's one thing to believe that there's no God, but it's quite another thing to say things like, there exists not a shred of respectable evidence for God's existence, or, quote, science shows that God does not exist, right?
So you take your Petri dish, you
Yeah.
titrate the thing, and it comes out, no God
No
exists
God,
here.
that's right, yeah. Or it's written all over the sky, right? When atheists make, he says, such grand claims, they're either frightfully ignorant of the relevant complexities, or, he says, they're bluffing, right? In either case, they should stop, if not for no other reason than that they're damaging their own credibility. How about that? So he's concerned about the credibility of atheists.
It seems what they're doing is they're utilizing kind of our big thing, especially in the Western world, of science. You know, if science says it, that's the big stamp of approval.
Oh, yeah.
Gravity pulls things towards the earth.
Science says it, I believe it.
Water freezes at zero.
Yeah.
So there's the science stamp of approval. And so by making these claims that we can scientifically prove that God doesn't exist, they're overreaching with what science is doing, and therefore hurts what true science does.
Yeah, good. Yeah, and he says they should exercise some intellectual restraint. Right, is what he's suggesting. He says part of the solution is to realize and admit that belief and unbelief are each far more than a matter of reason. Reason alone won't settle the issue. No one is neutral.
Ooh.
Where have we heard that before?
Yeah,
right?
Romans 1.
Yeah, right. So the no neutrality thing here, right?
Yeah.
We all kind of see through our own glasses. Reason doesn't convince necessarily. I mean, it does, right? He doesn't throw out reason, right?
Right.
But he says alone, he says, won't settle the issue. So this is why debates over God, he says, God's existence can sometimes seem like making a legal case for your devotion to your spouse, right? No matter how reasonable you are, you better get flowers.
Which I think John Lennox has actually done to Dawkins before.
Yeah.
Is your wife faithful? Can you prove it?
Yeah. So what he wants to do here is he wants to try to work through these particular issues with regard to skepticism, right? He says, the lesson I claim is that uber optimism about science leads to moral skepticism along a path through atheism. And then he parenthetically says, or what I will sometimes call naturalism, the view that the natural world is all there is. He says, the problem in the garden was, at least to his light, that the folks there, Adam and Eve, weren't skeptical enough. So never get into a stranger's car no matter what kind of fruit he offers you, right?
Yeah.
So there's three claims here that, or at least three main sections of this book that he wants us to be aware of, that he's going to work through, right? Three main sections. The first section, he says, is by far the shortest. He says, I lay some epistemological groundwork. So, epistemology is a study of kind of the nature of knowledge. And
how do we know things?
Yeah, that kind of stuff. Yeah. So in particular, I look at the limits of what we can know in general, considering our epistemic abilities with respect to sense perception and reason, our two main cognitive faculties.
So touch, sight, taste, smell, those are the sense perceptions.
Right.
If you're looking through a microscope, that's you using your senses to identify something. Telescope, a stone is rough. You're feeling it. Those types of things.
Yeah.
Reason is the 2 + 2 = 4.
Right.
If I do this, then this happens.
Right. So
is this the cause?
Yeah, causality.
Of,
Causality, yeah. He says, then once we've gotten our epistemological bearings, I turn to science, and in particular how we should think about its methods and claims. He says, my goal is by no means to denigrate science or to deny that it tells us important and surprising things about the world, but there are also good reasons to remain agnostic, he says, even doubtful about things we cannot directly observe, and we directly observe far less than many people imagine.
So it's interesting that he's saying that science is almost a step 2.
Yeah.
You have to have your senses, you have to have reason, and that gets you the ability to do science.
Yeah.
Which I don't know if people would really parse that out as particularly as
yeah.
what he is.
So most people would think that science is its own foundation, and what he's implying here is no. There is a further foundational, we might even call philosophical foundation here with regard to our epistemic abilities. We have to hold that they are, at least to a certain extent, lead us to a proper take on the way the world is, right? And our cognitive abilities. So we have to have some assumptions about those before we even get off the ground with regard to science.
Do our senses tell us the truth?
Yeah.
Are they accurate? How accurate are they?
Yeah.
Are we able to use them in time and place, or are they universal? So there's a lot there, and then we have the ability to do science utilizing those tools.
So science, given that particular take on it, isn't really the foundation. It stands on the foundation of these other two types of things that we have to almost make some assumptions about before we even get science off the ground. And so sometimes this is called a criticism of scientism. Scientism is the idea that science is the only discipline that gets us to the truth, right? Well, clearly, if it has a foundation these are more philosophical, this foundation, than science, then it can't be, the only discipline to get us to the truth, because the foundation of science aren't scientific claims. They're more philosophical claims, right?
You couldn't do science on science to get it.
Yeah.
So you have to appeal to a more foundational, a more basic set of ideas, like senses or reason logic.
Yeah. So that's kind of interesting. He doesn't want to. So his first claim is with regard to this issue here. He looks at the limits of what we can know, and then he wants to kind of turn to science and consider some issues with regard to science. He says in these first two sections, much of what I have to say applies to everybody, believers and unbelievers. So that he says we can all agree on much of what I say about epistemological limitations, including limitations of science, although the limitations are significantly worse if humans aren't the product of design. Right? So he throws that in there, right? But he says, suppose that naturalism were true, further suppose that science largely supports naturalism. What implications does this have? And here's his third issue here. For our standard view that there are objective moral standards, right? So he's going to do some epistemology, and then he's going to apply that to thinking about science, and then he wants to move to morality with regard to what he wants to discuss here, right? So he says in the third section, I'll argue that if naturalism is true, then there are no such standards, that is, objective moral standards.
So we saw this in one of our previous episodes, and we'll put a link here to refer to that. But this is the don't answer type deal. He's not saying that he accepts the viewpoint of the unbeliever by saying here's the be all end all. But if naturalism were true, what are the implications of that? And then showing skeptics that here's the conclusion that you would reach if this were the case.
Yeah, especially with regard to morality, right? Objective morality, right?
Yeah.
How does that?
You seem to lose it.
Yeah. That's really what he's going to argue here, right? That somehow we get. He says most atheists, however, would loathe to agree with his position with regard to objective morality, right? Their reluctance, he says, is understandable, but if they're serious about their skepticism, about following reason wherever it leads, he says, he believes they will reluctantly agree, or at least he would if he were an atheist.
Yes, so he's calling atheists to be, or skeptics at least, to be better skeptics.
Yeah, to be consistent skeptics,
Yeah.
right? To follow your skepticism out on every issue, not just the things that you want to be skeptical about, but let's apply it consistently across the board, even with regard to your atheism, even with regard to science or anything else, right?
Right.
Let's be skeptical about all of it if we're going to be skeptical.
Why stop at point B? Why not continue to point A or down to point Z?
Yeah. And we'll see here that he admits to being a skeptic, so he doesn't think it's anything wrong with it, but he's going to argue that you need to have the right kind of skepticism.
Well,
right?
and we would take this with any truth claim, especially large truth claims. Joseph Smith comes to us and says, "I found the lost gospel on golden plates." Should you automatically believe, or should you apply skepticism?
Yeah.
Well, it seems like skepticism would cause you to be held back from believing absolutely anything and buying any type of snake oil or whatever might happen.
Golden plate books or whatever.
But however, if someone says,
I don't know what they were worth. How much gold was it?
well, they were taken back up to heaven. So
he didn't get a chance to keep them.
But if we had extreme skepticism on things like the polio vaccine, well then we'd all still be dying from polio.
I'm not taking that. Yeah. I don't know. How do I know that? How I know that? You're going to give me polio in order to cure polio? What is up with that? Right? Yeah. All right, good. So then, so that's kind of his preface. So we've gone over here the forward, the preface to the book, and so we have a little idea of where he's headed here. So we can kind of jump in now to his introduction, and again, he's going to pursue kind of the take of where he's headed with this book in this introduction.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
And it is called
Skepticism and Contemporary Atheism.
Yeah.
So Science and Morality, the Engines of Atheism, is kind of his focus for the second and third parts of the book. He says that perhaps the most conspicuous trait of contemporary atheists, besides atheism, of course, is that they're especially fervent about two things: science and morality.
Yeah. Because,
of course, what else would you fall back on?
Yeah. Now it's interesting here. Traditional atheism back in the day, you didn't necessarily, although maybe you could make a case that they were really concerned about morality. But what he suggests here is what really tipped the scales with regard to the new atheist is the 9/11 event.
Yeah.
Right?
So people like Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, people along those lines that kind of rose out of. You're right. 9/11 allowed us to question a lot of things, but. It
allowed them to question religion with regard to morality.
Right. And we do remember, I mean, it was great for us in the 2000s. Everyone was talking about Christianity versus atheism, and it sparked a whole new set of books for us to go over, and it opened up conversation. And sadly now in 2019, it seems like we're going the other way, where everything's being put under the rug, or you can't offend anybody again. So hopefully we get that type of conversation back, because I think it allowed us all to clarify and codify where we stood, and I think we were all the better for it. We saw the intelligent design movement come out of it during that time too, and really. There were court cases for it. Whether those were
they
good
were
or bad,
a little
there were
earlier.
at least conversations that happened.
The real take on intelligent design was probably late 80s, 90s, that kind of stuff. So his issue, he says, well, I think that science and God are incompatible, right? And so he says that he wants to look closely at this line of thinking later, but for now, suffice it to say, he says that most atheists see science as underwriting their unbelief, right? And of course, he says here on the next page, here on page 21, it's only natural. Science and morality then are the drivers of contemporary atheism, and thus this sweet spot, he says, in the debate between believers and unbelievers, right?
Yeah.
So this issue of science and morality. So the issue here, what is the issue with regard to science and morality? Well, what he does is he takes us back to an age-old debate with regard to fact and value, the is-ought type of fallacy, that kind of stuff, right? He says, notice that science and morality follow along an all-important fact-value divide. Science tells us what is the case. Morality tells us what we ought to do, although some atheists believe that science also tells us what we ought to do, as we'll see. Humans, he says, seem to be hardwired, and so this is kind of an interesting point here that he's going to make here, and of course we agree with it. He's going to appeal to Romans 1 here, right?
Yes.
Humans seem to be hardwired to contemplate both conscience and cosmos, right? Even the Bible suggests this in the first chapter of Paul's letter to the Romans, right, which says, what he says here, that we are, he says that something in us is triggered by the created order, causing us to see that God exists, Romans 1:19 and 20.
Yeah. So that's the understanding that from a biblical standpoint, everybody knows that God is real, but they suppress the truth in their unrighteousness, and it causes certain actions from that suppression,
right? Because
you're actively rebelling. It's not a passive thing. It's something that is done by the very nature of who we are.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And that's the point he makes here. There seems to be something like a built-in, according to Romans chapter 1, a built-in faculty that causes immediate belief in God, or would cause it if it weren't for sin.
Right.
And so then in the next chapter he says, so Paul moves from this belief in God, this issue of whether or not God believes, and the fact that we kind of see it in the creation. In the next chapter, chapter 2 of Romans, Paul suggests that humans come equipped with a built-in moral faculty, or as he puts it, a moral law written on their hearts, right? So we have these two issues here with regard to belief in God and morality. Right?
Big, because his charge against the Jews in chapter 2 was, yes, you have the law and you follow it, not complete all the time. So you're hypocrites in that way. However, those without the law, the unbelieving Gentiles, they codify morality within their law or within their consciousness.
Yeah,
and
they have the law written, he argues,
right
in their heart. Right.
So things like justice and fairness seems to be innate in man, and so our laws like don't murder people, don't deprive people of their property through trickery, having equal scales, that seems to be a universal human concept, but still within that world of this conscious-based application, they still fall short. They're still acting contradictory to what even their own mind tells them what they should be doing. So where does that all come from? That all stems from God writing the law on man's heart, being made in the image of God, and so both Jew and Gentile can be held to God's standard of perfection and the need for a Savior.
Right. So there's one standard, and both fall.
Yeah.
Both fall short of that standard.
Yep.
He says, in any case, we seem especially attuned to the wiles of nature and the commands of morality. And then what he does is he talks about, he says, and these propensities were not lost on the great Enlightenment philosopher Immanuel Kant, who famously said, and then we get this quote from this Kant quote, which is famous, by the way. Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe. The more often and enduring reflection is occupied with them. Kant goes on to say, the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. Right? So that's.
Boy, that doesn't sound like naturalism.
Yeah, I know. Kant has inspired more than his share of skepticism about God's existence, whether he intended to or not. Stokes tells us. So he says that Kant's overall philosophical project was a monumental attempt to reconcile the new scientific picture with the traditional one that we're morally responsible beings, that is, to reconcile the laws of nature with the laws of morality. So he suggests that part of the Enlightenment project that Kant was working on with this reconciliation project with regard to the laws of nature and the laws of morality.
Yeah, because during the Enlightenment, you did see both a rise in Christian education, as far as people wanting to go back to the sources, infantes, and find better translations of the Greek Bible. But you also had an increase in atheism, which is almost unheard of throughout the world at that time. Right. Somebody, it seemed, believed in a god or gods or capital G God at some point in time. The Enlightenment allowed people to kind of check that and say, do we need that? Yeah,
so and he makes this point here. He says folks felt they called it was a sense of freedom is what he called it, right? Which was at a premium during the Enlightenment. He says we might even summarize the Enlightenment the way a philosopher called Popper, so he's a famous philosopher of science, did as liberation, that is self-emancipation through knowledge. But what exactly were the shackles? How were we, what were we liberated from? Well, in a word, religion, right? Not that all Enlightenment thinkers were atheists. Many were deists. Of course, many were still Christians. But a sizable portion of them saw organized religion as oppressive and overbearing and intellectual dictatorship. And so they sought the freedom to think for themselves. They were called free thinkers, among other things, and so that was part of what was going on in Enlightenment. Yeah. Throw off the shackles of religion, we can use, for Kant anyway, reason and others, free thinking in order to come up with, ideas to be liberated, to be emancipated from the old religious thinking, right? The outdated, medieval, dark ages.
God subscribes to morality and tells you the oughts, what you ought to do. Yeah. But I think that's why you see a big push, especially in kind of the hard sciences, for kind of the social Darwinism to come about. Why should you and I not kill each other right now? Well, if we look at the Darwinian aspect for survival,
you're bigger than I am, and I don't want.
Well, that we shouldn't engage in warfare because it mutually benefits us to come together and pool our resources together, or at least not kill each other for resources. So
the idea of reciprocation is the basic
and so
idea.
That's supposed to be. And I've never heard anyone articulate this, and it's probably my fault more than anything. I don't see where that's ingrained. What gene or what DNA strand can I point to and say, yes, that's the no killing my neighbor. Oh, but except when I do kill my neighbor, what is that a different gene? Yeah. And so social Darwinism seems to be this big push, and a lot of people are saying, like, why are we afraid of snakes? Because it helps us to survive. And so when we are afraid of the dark and we like horror movies, it's because we hearken back to those days when that was beneficial to get us to survive. Well, where is that? I don't know where that's at.
So and actually the new name of the social Darwinism is social biology, or it's relatively new. It's starting to be passé. Yeah. Social biology was kind of replaced the idea of survival of the fittest for reciprocal relationships that allow for survival. That's kind of the new thinking with regard to social biology. But in either way, that type of thinking gets God out of the picture and attempts to at least explain morality, if not giving us a basis for it, at least explain it with regard to the.
It might not give you a full ought. Why should we do this, or why ought we do this? But at least it seems to try and trap it within a physical, naturalistic viewpoint, so that you can say scientifically. And there's your buzzword where we can say, well, in Romans it says, and that to us is a meme signal, to use a Dawkins phrase, to say this is where we draw our source of truth from. They say scientifically we know this, and so they can kind of punch that up.
Good. So we have this issue of liberation, freedom, and so he says these enlightened groups. He says emphasis these groups, rather, he says, continue the Enlightenment emphasis. These groups, he means folks like Richard Rorty and Lawrence Krauss, and Dawkins and Dennett and folk, on reason and freedom. He says it's no coincidence then that the late Christopher Hitchens ended his searing attack on religion. God is not great with the chapter in conclusion, the need for a new enlightenment, right? He says the idea seems to be that we should be wary of others, of what others tell us, particularly those others who are religious, right? Yeah.
Got to watch out for them.
We should be skeptical of authority and think for ourselves.
Which, I mean, Dawkins says that, it's worse than child abuse, and that you should look at people with disgust who tell you that they believe in God because they are backwards people.
Yeah.
However, within even his own book, he makes the point that religion is there for survival purposes. So it seems like, wouldn't you?
You can't have it both ways.
Yeah,
I think. Right.
It's almost like he's acting contradictory to what his truth claims are.
So this idea of then being skeptic, he wants to pursue this. Obviously, this is the main thrust of his book here. Yeah. So he gives us 3 different takes on skepticism, right? So he says, if knowledge unlocks freedom, then whether the notions of doubt and skepticism that Hitchens so highly valued. He says knowledge and skepticism seems to be polar opposites of one another. So he gives us the first kind of skepticism. He calls it a full-blown skeptic. It's someone who doubts that we can have knowledge about anything whatsoever, right? So that's full-blown skepticism, that we can't know anything, right? Of course, now he doesn't want to pursue that because then that kind of almost defeats itself,
right?
You know?
And, well, and you can kind of say, yes, that is the extreme side, but at the same time, no one honestly believes that, because by making a claim that we can never know, you make a claim that you're
making
know.
A knowledge claim, right?
Yeah. We can never know anything is a knowledge claim that you can know something, because that's at least one thing, which then defeats.
We can never know anything except the thing that the fact that we can never know anything, right? Something like that.
Although
which is,
I would like to see Michael Shermer, who's the big Skeptic magazine guy. I would like to see Skeptic magazine be actually skeptic, and Bigfoot doesn't exist, but then I want to see skepticism for the opposite end of that, and I think that would make for a true skeptic magazine.
Yeah. So, and that's kind of the kind of issues here that he gets at in this book, right? He wants skeptics to be really skeptics. He doesn't want full-blown skepticism, though. And then he says there are, of course, kinder, gentler versions of skepticism, right? And said, according to these, he says, we do not or cannot have knowledge merely about specific topics. So we can call this specific topic skepticism, right? What does he mean here? Well, for example, that we can be skeptics about God's existence, right? And so that's a specific topic skepticism.
So a true agnostic would be someone that's
something like that, right? But he doesn't want to limit it to just God. He says we might be skeptics about the physical world outside our minds, about unobservable scientific entities like electrons, quarks, or gravitons, or about objective moral laws. People can also be skeptical about events like a worldwide flood or evolution or the Big Bang or the moon landing, right? And so, this is, he calls it a kinder, gentler notion of skepticism. So we have full-blown skepticism. We have this specific topic skepticism. And so he's going to use this specific topic skepticism. But what he wants to move to is what he calls sober skepticism. This is his third kind. He says, but skepticism can also refer to something much less controversial, something more mundane and practical. This kind of skepticism is an overall, he says, epistemological stance, a kind of safety-first attitude toward what one believes. He calls this an intellectual caution, right? And he says this even kinder, even gentler skepticism merely says that we shouldn't be, unduly credulous, that we should filter our beliefs using a sufficiently fine dosatic sleeve, right? Doxa is the Greek for belief, so a belief mechanism here. He says, and he wants to call this sober skepticism. Sober skepticism can obviously be embraced by the believer and the unbeliever alike At least it's obvious to me, he said. Right.
Yeah, so this would be something like, I come up to you and I say, a UFO has landed in my backyard.
Yeah.
And you say, that seems a little outlandish, but I'm willing to go with you on this journey to see it. And once I see it, then okay.
Then I can reevaluate what I think. So this is kind of sober skepticism. It's an intellectual caution, right? And so these are the three then, right? This full-blown skepticism, which he's not going to talk about at all. This specific topic skepticism, which he is going to talk about because the specific topic skepticism.
You want to focus on.
Yes, skepticism about God.
Mm-hmm.
So he wants to talk about that, and so he's going to spend some time on that. But the one that he likes is what he calls a sober skepticism. This is this general intellectual caution, the safety first attitude that he wants us, it's kind of an overall epistemological attitude with regard to the things that we should believe.
Yeah. He calls it epistemologically savvy and streetwise.
That's right. He says, unfortunately, the two main kinds of skepticism we'll consider in this book, sober skepticism and the skeptical topical skepticism about God, are often conflated.
Yeah.
That is, in other words, you have sober skepticism and skepticism about God somehow interlinked as if they're basically the same thing.
Yeah.
And he wants to kind of deconflate these types of things.
Because we have people within our own camp who would claim, God told me this, or God visited me here, or I have the ability to do this because of God. And it seems like if you were to take just a full belief approach, then you're all over the map on theologically where you're at, or just could be taken advantage of, or you're unable to parse if someone is telling the truth or not, or if someone's mentally ill or just mistaken.
Yeah.
And so to conflate the two means that we would be joining unbelievers of God in that same camp. But we should also kind of have this healthy, sober skepticism.
Right. So the question is, the sober skepticism, is it part and partial with skepticism about God, or are they two distinct type of things, which he's going to argue that they are? In fact, what he says is, my goal here isn't to show that there are good reasons for a sober skeptic to believe in God, though I hardly believe there are. Instead, I will try to make a decent case that there is a conflict between sober skepticism and science-induced atheism. That is, skepticism with regard to that leads to atheism with regard to God. Right. So that's what he wants to kind of decouple these things and say, hey, they're two different things, and one is a good thing, and we have to really work through the other one. Right. So if you're only skeptical, he says, then obviously no new ideas would come about, and he wants to avoid that type of thing.
Yeah. Which he's a scientist. He's got patents, so he knows he knows the working science, not just the theory science.
Right. And so it's probably we're probably getting late in the day here, but we should just. So what he's trying to accomplish here, and he says it on page 29 here at the top there, at the very last. He says the pressing question then is this: what does a good skeptic look like, particularly when it comes to science and morality? Right? I'm afraid there's no simple answer beyond learning some philosophy and carefully studying the issues. And so let's do that. He wants us to work through that.
Yeah.
So what does a good skeptic look like with regard to science and morality? Which is a really provocative question, because what do you mean skeptic about science, right? And what do you mean skeptic about morality? These things we take for granted.
Yeah.
We take science for granted, and we take morality for granted. We know that there's certain things that are just wrong and others that are just right. So what does a good skeptic looks like with regard to skepticism, with regard to science and with regard to morality? And he wants to pursue what that is in this book.
And learning some philosophy and carefully studying the issues, and luckily enough, you've got us for going through this book to explain the philosophy, having Tony explain the philosophy, really, and then looking carefully at the issues and kind of building upon what Stokes has has written in his How to Be an Atheist.
Yeah, so we're excited about this one. This
Yeah.
one is this is a really neat book.
We really liked this one
Yeah,
when we went through it the first time.
Yeah, and Stokes has done a good job, and I think he's going to keep our interest with regard to these various ideas.
Yeah.
And so we look forward to working through these.
Yeah, so for this book, pretty much, unless if a chapter gets split into two, one chapter a week until we're all done. There's about 18, 19 chapters here. And then if we do have to split it up into two, you'll get an episode back-to-back within a day or two. So that's how we're going to go through this book. So if you want to read ahead and or read along with us, feel free to take it at whatever pace you'd like. And if you want to just sit back and let us do the heavy lifting, we're here for that too. So thanks for joining us on Cave of the Cross Apologetics, where we don't just apologize for our faith, we do apologetics.